For those watching by a live webcast, there is an agenda online at the KDE website to follow today's board meeting. I also want to thank our interpreters and call captioning group for the valuable service they provide to the department and to the board. Thank you. Cell phones, we ask that you take a moment here to silence those. And with that, Marty, if you would call the roll.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Dr. King, Secretary Ramsey, Joe Papalia.
Here.
Amanda Stamper will be just a little bit late this morning. Rich Gimmel.
Here.
Hal Heiner.
Here.
Milton Seymour.
Here.
Laura Timberlake.
Here.
Kathy Gornick.
Here.
Ben Cundiff.
Here.
Tracy Cusick.
Here.
And Gary Houchins.
Here.
You have a quorum, sir.
We do. We have a quorum. Thank you. Thank you, Marty. Would you please join me now in the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
If you would join me now in a minute of silence, just in consideration of the important items that are on our agenda today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, first item on our agenda today is the amendment to 703 KAR 5270, the Transition Readiness Regulation. This is a discussion item only today and a first reading. And Associate Commissioner Rhonda Sims. Commissioner.
Commissioner's joining me here.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Morning.
Morning.
Commissioner.
This is the first reading of a regulation where we are proposing to make a minor change in the way we define transition readiness, specifically in the grade required for dual credit coursework, whether it's in academic readiness for dual credit courses or in career readiness for CTE-approved CPE dual credit coursework. The regulation as it is today requires that students earn a minimum of a B in order to be considered transition ready. The proposal is that we would change the minimum grade for consideration of transition readiness from a B to a C. We're making that recommendation because we believe the C would be more appropriate as a minimum standard for considering students' transition ready. That recommendation would also be more in line with the way a C is treated in post-secondary education. So a student earning a C in a post-secondary course today would have that course available to transfer across institutions if you're a post-secondary student. As well, if you're remaining at your institution, if you earn a grade of C in a course, that course counts toward graduation for you. So we want to be clear that we want and we expect our students to strive for excellence. We want the absolute best. The reason we're making this recommendation, though, is as a minimum standard in the course, we believe that C would be a more appropriate mark. We also believe that it would help to safeguard against one of the threats that we have, which is grade inflation. We do have some concern that if we leave the mark at a B, understanding that a student needs to make a B in order for the course to be considered as a part of transition readiness, that it could lead to the artificial inflation of grades when in fact a student's performance hasn't been that of a B level.
Without
Yes,
this
sir.
change, if a student moved into college, he would get full credit for a C grade in a course at that college, but not for a C grade in dual credit.
That's absolutely right. The student would be able to take that C into their major, onto their college transcript. It would count toward graduation for them at the post-secondary institution, but it would not count toward our transition readiness requirement in Kentucky.
Commissioner, question, one other item. From a clarity standpoint in the regulation, these regulations said 2 courses or more, several places on AP, IB, Cambridge, dual credit. And as a minimum regulation, was thinking the or more should be struck so that we know the minimum really is 2. It's not.
You're
some other
absolutely right.
number. Will that be?
You're absolutely right. We'll ensure that that's taken care of before the second reading as well.
Okay.
There are 2 references actually in the regulation itself, and that's on the screen. It is on page 8 and page 9. On page 8, it's at line 11, and then we have the same phrasing on page 9. So you can see just the strike through that we were bringing forward for this first look.
So on line 12, for instance, there, where it says on Cambridge or AP 2 or more courses, again,
Then we
wherever we
can-
say or
we'll
more,
put
I
the
think,
strike.
if it's a
Yes.
minimum standard, it's ought to say, this is the standard.
We
So,
can certainly do that.
Great. Keep that clear. Other comments or questions? Okay. Speak just a minute for the process before the board, before the second reading.
Yes, sir. So before this reading, we have taken the regulation before the local superintendent's advisory council, as we do with all of our regulations, for their input. They were actually very supportive of this change. We bring it to you for a first reading. We make revisions based on your feedback. Sometimes we get feedback and suggestions from other stakeholder groups as well that we incorporate and bring it back for a second reading before the local superintendent's advisory council and then back to the KBE for consideration for action. If the KBE votes to approve the regulation, then it moves forward into a public comment period. There's a 30-day public comment period during which the public is encouraged to submit comments. As well, there is a public hearing. Those are at this building where the public is invited to come and participate in a hearing. We hear any and everyone who shows up to a public hearing. We document those comments. And as required by law, the Kentucky Board of Education considers every comment made electronically that comes in the mail, that someone makes publicly at the public hearing. considers every comment, and it becomes a part of your statement of consideration. That statement of consideration would come before the State Board of Education in probably a February meeting, if you were to approve this in December, at which time the State Board would make a decision on revisions to the potential regulation, and would vote again to adopt, whether or not to adopt the regulation and the statement of consideration.
And the timeline that you laid out, would this new standard apply for accountability purposes for transition readiness? Would it apply for this current year?
It would. So the recommendation we're making is for students who are taking dual credit courses this year, if they were to earn a C in a dual credit course this year, when we report accountability in the next academic year, that C would count toward transition readiness for that school.
Okay, assuming all of the hurdles.
Yes, sir.
That's right, because there are some legislative reviews after you complete your process here. But once the effective date happens, we'd be able to apply it.
Yeah.
So data reporting in fall of 2019.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Other questions, comments, concerns? Okay, thank you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.
All right, we're on to our next item here. It's the amendments to 704 KAR 3305, minimum high school graduation requirements. This is a second reading.
I would just, oh, there it is. How did
Commissioner, are you or your team's going to kick this off for us this morning?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So once again, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get into the details of our proposal, which we will go through this morning for this second reading, given the importance of this topic, we feel it necessary to really take a step back, walk back, and ensure that we have covered every possible angle here. But before we get to the details of the proposal, I would like, Mr. Chair, to spend some time talking just a little bit about where we are as a state educationally, because that context is incredibly important for considering such a significant change in minimum high school graduation requirements as we were proposing. Maybe. We can begin while we get the battery changed.
Susan, to go on to the next slide.
I think
Yeah.
that,
Yeah, oh, there you go.
Thank you, Susan.
Susan can advance it.
So we begin with some numbers that I believe all of you are familiar with. That is the reality that in the class of 2017, we deemed 65% of Kentucky high school graduates to be prepared for post-secondary education and or prepared for the workforce. That's by our own measure. And we use the class of 2017 rather than the class of 2018 because as we have phased into this new accountability system, our transition readiness indicator does not include dual credit data. And so next year, we'll have a more complete indication of what college and career readiness looks like. But so for the class of 2017, and this number has not changed substantially, 35% of the kids who we walked across the stage and handed a diploma to by our own measure, by our own metric, we deemed to be not appropriately prepared for college or the workforce. Yet we handed them diplomas anyway, and we wished them good luck. %40 of Kentucky high school graduates do not pursue post-secondary education upon leaving high school. About 60% of our kids, on average, from year to year, move on from high school and immediately into post-secondary education. 40% go directly into the workforce, or in many cases actually don't go into the workforce, but they don't pursue post-secondary education or training. Most of that 40% as well leave high school without a credential, without skills, without the tools that they need to be able to get a job where they can make a wage to take care of themselves. On average, we send fewer of our students into post-secondary education than the rest of the nation. On average, across the country, we send about 70% of our kids on to post-secondary education. That is despite us having one of the highest high school graduation rates in the country. About 90% of our kids graduate high school. It's remarkable, truly, the gains that we've made in high school graduation in our state over the last decade. I think it's the result of a tremendous amount of work by some folks who are here in this room, to help our communities, help our schools, help our parents understand the importance of a high school diploma. And so I'll never take anything away from that work. I think it is incredibly important. One of the things that we have missed, however, in that work is, while stressing the importance of a high school diploma, in some ways, the relevance of that diploma has been lost. Because in our effort to increase high school graduation rates, it appears that we have not ensured that the diploma that we were awarding students was one that has been awarded based on students' readiness to go on to the next level. And so we do have the reality that we graduate students from high school, not in 1 or 2 or 3 districts across our Commonwealth, but across our Commonwealth, we graduate kids from high school who lack even the basic skills in reading, in mathematics, and as our college and career readiness numbers showed, who lack the skills and ability to move on to post-secondary education and be successful. That is evidenced by the fact that many of our students who do in fact move on to post-secondary education, when they get there, they require remediation before they can take credit-bearing courses. So we've awarded high school diplomas to kids, a diploma that is supposed to indicate that students have attained certain basic skills and have a certain degree of readiness. They take that ticket and they advance to post-secondary education, but they're told once they get there that they are required to enroll for a fee into post-secondary courses, but courses that they earn no credit for. In essence, we are asking students to go to post-secondary education and to pay to receive the education that we should have ensured that they got before they left high school. Because to be clear, the expectation for taking credit-bearing courses at the post-secondary level is nothing outside of what students should have in fact received at the high school level. Currently in our Kentucky high school graduation requirements, we are one of the few states in the nation that require that all of our students take Algebra 2. When you take a look at the Kentucky academic standards aligned with Algebra 2, you look at the course expectations for Algebra 2, you find that this is really a pretty high-level math course. In order to pass, successfully complete an Algebra 2 course, students would have had to demonstrate a pretty high level of competence in mathematics. This is the level of competence that far surpasses any low bar that we have discussed thus far around this proposal. If you have taken and successfully completed an Algebra 2 course, there is absolutely no way in the world that you should not be equipped to move on into post-secondary education and begin to take very basic first level, 100 level math courses. So the finding that every single one of our high school students, of our high school graduates, have in fact successfully completed an Algebra 2 course, but many of them enter post-secondary education needing to take remedial math coursework on their own dime before they are able to enroll in credit-bearing coursework is unconscionable. These two truths are irreconcilable. You cannot, on one hand, say that we are ensuring that our students are, in fact, taking and successfully completing high-level math, but they forget it all within the year or two by the time they get to post-secondary education. Friends, that is not what's happening. I would suggest that the truth of the matter is more like this. We have a requirement on paper that our students successfully complete Algebra 2, when the real-world reality is that we have a requirement that all of our students enroll in Algebra 2, but that there's no real bar or measure that all of our students have to meet in order to successfully complete it. We're playing games with ourselves. And I know this board well enough to know that that's not what you're interested in. I know that this board is interested in real change, real learning, preparedness for what comes next for students, and that it doesn't matter a whole lot to you what's on paper or what we say we do. What matters to you is what we actually do and how prepared students actually are to transition to the next level. And so this finding that we successfully complete Algebra 2, this requirement, yet students move on into post-secondary education and have to pay for coursework that they don't get credit for, we cannot continue that.
Wayne, I know you didn't quite say that that a diploma guarantees that you won't have to take remedial courses in college, but just to take that a little bit farther, if that were the case, or if we thought that should be the case, and the colleges use an objective ACT score standard in some cases to determine remedial courses, would that follow that we shouldn't grant diplomas to people who make 16s and 17s on their ACT?
That would be an approach. That could be an approach. definitely, if we could determine what the appropriate score on the ACT or an exam would be for that standard, that could be an approach that this board or this state could take. I want to take a look at a little more Kentucky data to paint this context for us. These are 8th grade reading scores, our most recent ones from K-Prep data. So at the proficient and distinguished level, which is where I want to draw your attention to, we see that 63% of our students at the 8th grade level scored at the proficient or distinguished level. As you travel down that column and the numbers are broken out by student population, you see that there is quite a bit of variation depending on the group of students that you're talking about. The first difference that catches your eye is the difference between female and male students. 70% of our female students at the proficient level of higher, while only 56% of our male students. Now, let me be clear about my beliefs before we go further. My beliefs about education, my beliefs about teaching and learning. I do not believe that particular populations of students, whether they be by gender, whether they be by race and ethnicity, whether they be by socioeconomic status, I do not believe that belonging to any particular population of students means you are more or less capable of learning at high levels. And because that is my belief, when I look at the disparity between the performance of different populations of students, it causes me to ask questions like, what are we, and when I say we, I mean the collective we, schools, parents, communities, what are we doing that leads to such disparities between these groups of students? And as an educator, it leads me to say that we have to do something different, because I know those different populations of students are all capable. Some of them need different things in order to learn. Some of them need different approaches. But I think it is incumbent upon us, the adults, the schools, their parents, their communities, to first of all recognize the fact that there is something incredibly wrong in our system when we have such disparate outcomes based on the population of students that we're talking about. So people accuse me oftentimes of saying, well, you act like parents don't matter, and home life doesn't matter, and community life doesn't matter. Let me be very clear here. Parents, home life, community, they are all incredibly important, incredibly important. The reason you hear me talk most often about schools is because I'm the chief state schools officer. And it is my responsibility to think about the ways that we are preparing young people in our schools. So it's not that I don't think those things are important, but it is my job to think very intentionally and very critically about our practice in schools. And so yes, unapologetically, I will talk more often about what we can do and what we should do in schools to improve those numbers than what we can and should do at home. So you see the gap between female and male students. You also see pretty significant gaps between students based on race and ethnicity. White students, 67% at the proficient level of high or higher. The percent of African American students at the level of proficient or higher should make you sick to your stomach. At the 8th grade level, 38% of African American students across our state reading at the level of proficient or higher. So one of the things I was asked at the LSAC meeting by one of the superintendents was, what are the data? How can you tell us that there's a problem? How do we know that there's a problem, in fact, that we're graduating kids who struggle with reading? To which I answered, I think our 8th grade data are a really good indication, because I could be wrong, but I doubt it. I could be wrong, but I doubt that there's a significant difference between the 8th grade data showing that 38% of African American students are reading at grade level, and then by the time they graduate, it's 70 or 80%. I do not believe that's what's happening. So I think this is a pretty good indicator. Even if you give room for growth and say, by every group, you expand by 10% more kids reading at the level of proficient or higher, that would say that's 73% of kids. We still have a problem. For African American students, that would mean 48%, less than half of African American students reading at the level of proficient or higher. A little over half of Hispanic students scoring at that level. And you all can see the data. One last thing I'll point to is the percent of students at the level of free and reduced price lunch. A little over half, 53% of students who receive free or reduced price lunch. That's a low number. I want you to think about it alongside, however, the percentage of African American students. Because sometimes folks will make the argument that it's only disparity based on socioeconomic status and not race. What the data actually show is that it is the intersection of the two, that they have to be considered together. Because if we cut the data simply by socioeconomic status, simply by income, yes, there's disparity between economically disadvantaged students and non-economically disadvantaged students. But when we splice those two variables, there's a significant interaction effect between race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status. And so we have to consider both. Mathematics data is even more troubling. For all students in our most recent data, 46% of students scoring at the level of proficient or higher. The disparity between male and female students persists, but it's not as wide, we see, as it was with reading. The disparity between African American students and white students, Hispanic students and white students persists. Asian students continue to be our leaders in terms of the percent that are proficient or higher. Free and reduced price lunch, you see only 35% of our kids who would be called economically disadvantaged at the level of proficient or higher in mathematics. I think the challenges associated without foundational skills in reading are pretty evident and pretty clear to everyone. But just to talk for a moment about the challenges of not having basic foundational skills in mathematics, I want to tell a couple stories. I'll give you a couple examples. It is not uncommon in conversations with young people, the post-secondary level, who are preparing to go into elementary education, to hear them say, I hate math. I can't do math. I wish I didn't have to teach math. Now, that's no indictment on the young people that are going into our profession. In fact, we need to increase the number of high-quality folks that are coming into our profession to teach our kids. We have a serious problem right now with attracting teachers to the profession. But with that said, when young people, pre-service teachers, say something like, I hate math, I wish I didn't have to teach math, typically, and Gary, you teach at the post-secondary level as well, most of us don't bat an eye. consider if those same young people said, I hate reading. I struggle with reading. I wish I didn't have to teach reading. That might get our attention. That might get our attention, but the reality is foundational skills in mathematics for the world that we live in, for the economy that we have, for the job opportunities that are available for students, foundational skills in mathematics are incredibly important. Incredibly important. In fact, so important that if we cannot ensure that our kids have better foundational skills, better foundational preparation in mathematics, many of the careers that are available to them will be closed to them. Even at the middle and high school levels. I've talked to folks with different programs at the high school level, and amazing opportunities available to kids. But if they don't get to 8th or 9th grade sometimes, with the foundational level of math required, even those opportunities within high school are closed to them. So we have to do a much better job with foundational mathematics, and we have to do a better job of closing these gaps. You cannot tell me that 23% of African American students scoring at the level of proficient or higher is not something that everybody across our state ought to be talking about. But we're failing to recognize the severity, the gravity of these data. Instead, and I've told some of you this before, one of the lost opportunities last week when we released test data for the 2018 academic year, you know what most of the conversation seemed to be around in our communities? It was about me. Instead of us reflecting on the fact that we have incredible work to do with better preparing our kids for the realities of post-secondary education, the realities of the workforce, the fact that we have enormous achievement gaps, the conversation in many of our education communities was about me and whether I had manufactured an accountability system to make schools look bad. First of all, I'll say this to you as my bosses, I am not that powerful. I have neither the intellectual capacity nor the authority to manufacture an accountability system to do that. I simply do not. My prayer, my hope is that we get past deflection and get back to the fact that these data indicate that our kids are in fact not learning at the levels that is appropriate for them to take advantage of the many career opportunities that are available to them today and tomorrow right here in this Commonwealth. I want to take a look quickly at NAEP data. NAEP, as you know, is referred to as our nation's report card. It gives us the opportunity to get a look at how our kids are doing in comparison to their peers across the country. It's one of the few assessments, if not only assessment, in Kentucky that our kids are taking that's not specifically assessing just Kentucky academic standards. And so I think it's a really good measure as well to put alongside what we do with our K-Prep data. Before we look at those data, though, I want to be clear on what the performance levels mean in NAEP. So we start at the basic level, and basic, as you see, denotes partial mastery of prerequisite skills. Proficient represents solid academic performance for each grade assessed, and then advanced denotes superior performance at each grade level addressed. In addition to those three performance levels, we typically also have a category that shows the percentage of our students that score below basic. So below even a partial mastery of prerequisite skills and knowledge. And that's the area where I want to really draw your attention to this morning, to the below basic category. meaning that these kids cannot or have not demonstrated at this point even partial mastery of the prerequisite knowledge and skills that are fundamental for proficient work at that grade level. Next slide, please. So in our 2017, our most recent NAEP results at the 8th grade level, if we take a look first at the below basic category, 25% of our students across the board in reading could not demonstrate even partial mastery of what was necessary to do grade level work. Basic is partial mastery. Below basic is not even partial mastery. 25%, that's a quarter of our kids. If we take a look down based on race and ethnicity, you see, even on the NAEP data, incredible gaps between the performance of populations of students. 22% of our white students scoring below basic. So almost 80% of our Caucasian students demonstrating partial mastery or more. With African American students, 46%, almost half of African American students, could not demonstrate even partial mastery in reading on our NAEP exam. 30% for our Hispanic students. Take a look down at free and reduced price lunch, 34% of free and reduced price lunch students. And I didn't say this before, but just as a reminder, I know you know this, when we say kids who receive free and reduced price lunch, economically disadvantaged kids in Kentucky, this is most of our kids. This is not a subset. In Kentucky, about 60% of the kids in our public schools receive or qualify for free and reduced price lunch. That's not the case in every state, but we need to keep that in mind. That category includes most of our kids. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at mathematics.
It's self-sustaining.
Only 35% or 35% of our students across the board in mathematics at the 8th grade level couldn't demonstrate even partial mastery of grade level material. Take a look at African American students. 63% of African American students on our last administration of NAEP, 63% could not demonstrate even partial mastery of grade level material. 44% of Hispanic students, and if we take a look back down to free and reduced price lunch, which again is most of our students, about 60%, almost half of those students could not demonstrate even partial mastery. Next slide, please. We're just about at the end of data. Our most recent ACT data. Now we have talked publicly about what we're seeing with ACT scores across the country and in Kentucky. There has been a dip in ACT scores at the national level. There has been a dip as well at the state level. I think, Rhonda, we're in the neighborhood of about 80% of districts saw a dip.
Yes.
It is highly unlikely that that kind of dip across the board happens just by chance. And so I'll give you my guess. This is not what ACT is saying, but this is what my guess is. I think there was probably something going on with the form of the assessment that led to some differences in scores, a dip in scores across the country and across the state. We are continuing to monitor that situation, Rhonda's in communication with ACT to talk about what that might be. With that said, I still believe there is some value in looking at these numbers. So the percent of our students with the 2018 ACT administration of the English part, percent reaching the CPE benchmark. These are the benchmarks that we've included as a part of our transition readiness system. So this is our 11th grade students.
What is that benchmark? Do you know?
What is the English score around it?
I can look that up. I think it's 19.
19, I think.
I think it's 19.
Is it 18 or 19?
19.
She's going to look up to make sure we're accurate. We'll note the CPE benchmarks are slightly lower than what the ACT benchmarks are. So ACT establishes benchmarks for what they believe are college readiness. Our benchmarks are slightly lower. And so when you look at the data, aside from these as well. 18. Aside from these data, make sure you remember that what ACT sets as benchmark is not usually the same as what we've set at the state level. So we've used the state level benchmarks. So with 18 being that benchmark, about half of our students reached that benchmark in the 11th grade. Only 27% of African American students.
Dr. Lewis,
Yes, sir.
I need to make a statement.
Yes, sir.
One thing you said a minute ago, that the scorn toward African Americans, and we're living with that every day, and how we ought to feel and how we ought to be sick all over this state. I like to say that one thing that I truly believe, that unless we convince the African American community that these are real scores and they reflect our children in our everyday work of life.
That's right.
The argument in most of our communities with leadership is that they don't believe those scores. They don't believe those scores to be true because they only uses a few analogies of a few children, because their children are doing wonderful. But the broader community, those are the scores, and that is reality. Until you can convince the broader community that this is real, and the old saying, proof is in the pudding, but it's real. We can see it in our workforce, we can see it in the jailhouses, we can see it everywhere.
That's exactly
Those are
right.
real.
That's right. And they bear out.
It is the revolving door. Now, how you get a message over to a culture and to a people, and I'm not speaking down because I live in that same community. I live my life, is that they have to be convinced for this 21st century because we are not ready. And mostly African American children. And then you look at the non-African American children, where they stand as well. So I'd like to applaud you that somehow we have got to get that message across. And it's not just going to be a few people, but it's going to take this whole community, this whole commonwealth, to get people to see the facts and see the data and what it's saying. Because your child is going to Harvard, your child is going to Yale, but my child is going to Eddyville and other places, and that's what we've got to say. Thank you, excuse me.
No, thank you, sir. And I agree with you. Part of the challenge with convincing folks, and if we're talking specifically about the African American communities, is that we have been sold often an argument that is untrue.
Yes.
It is not the fact that that the African American community looks at the numbers on their face and just says, that's not concerning to me. That's not the case at all. Mm-hmm. But they are being bombarded with arguments and being told by other folks that those numbers are not true, that to talk about those numbers, to talk about the lack of achievement, the lack of educational progress in the African American community is inappropriate because it's school shaming or it's teacher shaming. Mm-hmm. African American communities are often made to feel guilty because they demand better educational services for their kids, demand that their kids receive a more appropriate education, demand that we do, in fact, have progress for African American students. Every parent in this Commonwealth, I don't care what your race, your ethnicity, your socioeconomic status, the region of the state that you live in, you have the right to expect and demand of us, the public education system, that we are providing your child with an education that is appropriate for them. Because we, as the public education system, receive dollars for every kid that walks in our door. And I would suggest that when we, as the public education system, take those dollars, we are saying with taking those dollars that we will do absolutely everything within our power to meet that specific kid's educational needs. And if we are not inclined to meet every single kid's educational needs, then we should stop taking dollars for them. So I appreciate your comments. Next slide, please. ACT reading. We see much more of the same. About half of our students meeting the benchmark, 22% of African American students, 35% of economically disadvantaged students. Next slide. ACT math, as you might imagine, just like we've seen the pattern from our K-Prep data, just like we saw as evidenced in the NAEP data, we see played out in ACT data as well. About 40% of all students, 42% of white students, 16% of African American 11th graders at the CPE benchmark or higher, 25% of economically disadvantaged students. Next slide, please. So to your point, Reverend Seymour, about distrust of assessment data, disbelief in the fact that assessment data are real, that they do in fact indicate that we have a significant problem, a very, very serious problem across the board, and particularly with serving low-income kids and kids of color. Even if you are able to somehow discount all of those numbers, these data you cannot discount. Because the data I want to talk with you about next are data that are reflective of the post-school outcomes of our kids. This is real life. This is data from the Kentucky longitudinal system. This is what happened to the class of 2009-2010 in Kentucky. There were 37,000, little over 37,000 kids who were high school seniors in 2009-2010. Next slide. By 2017, over 11,000 had no college experience by 2017 with an annual wage of just about $20,000 a year. Now, when you consider the fact that these students by 2017 had no college experience, also consider the fact that on this side of the Great Recession, about 80% of all the jobs created in this country have required some post-secondary education. And so these kids are out into the workforce or not in the workforce with nothing. Nothing that has prepared or equipped them to take advantage of the opportunities that are before them. Next slide. 25,000, almost 26,000 of those students actually entered college. 16,000 completed not a single program. That's over half. over half of the students in the class of 2009, 2010 went into college and left without a certificate. Some certificates, as you know, you can complete in as little as 6 months, as little as a year. They exited without a certificate, without a diploma, without a 2-year degree, without a 4-year degree. That's most of the kids that we sent into post-secondary education. And those students earned an average annual wage of over $20,000. Now remember, the students who had no college experience had an annual wage of about $19,000. These students have an average annual wage of about $20,000. But I would guess that these students are probably even worse off because they went into college and probably took on debt.
Yeah.
Yet they're exiting in the same place educationally and skill-wise as their cohorts who didn't go anywhere. This is a tragedy. Next slide, please. Just about 1,100 completed a credential, earning a wage of almost $23,000. 1,600 completed a 2-year degree, earning a wage of about $27,000. You're starting to see a jump now. And 6,800 completed a 4-year degree with an average annual wage of $31,000, almost $32,000. So it's really clear that it is important for our kids not just to go to education. We're not sending enough into post-secondary education. It's important for them to go. It is even more important for them to leave with a credential. Because going to college, whether it's a 2-year program, a certificate, or 4-year program, does you no good if you leave with nothing. So our emphasis has to be on getting more to go and better preparing them to be successful when they get there. Next slide. We have talked quite often about the reality in this economy that a high school diploma is not enough. And it's not. It absolutely is not enough. We have to send our kids on to post-secondary education. But I want to add something to that recognition. Recognizing that students have to earn more than a high school diploma does not negate the fact that the high school diploma has to be meaningful. Because if the high school diploma is not meaningful, then we send them on to post-secondary education and we get the results that we're getting. When you consider all the data that we've talked about this morning, the fact that, large percentages of our kids don't have basic skills in reading, don't have basic skills in mathematics, by our own measure, are not prepared to be successful in college or the workforce, is it any wonder that when they get to post-secondary education, that most of them are leaving without a credential? Friends, it does not take rocket science to come to the realization that if you send kids to college without preparation, they're probably not going to be successful. And so, yes, I want to continue to celebrate Kentucky's high school graduation rate. We will continue to celebrate high school graduation in Kentucky. It is a major milestone in kids' lives. But I will not celebrate the awarding of Kentucky high school diplomas to kids that we know are not well prepared to be successful. Rather than celebrate, we should all hang our heads in shame if we have anything to do with the continued reality that we hand high school diplomas to kids, telling them to their face that they're ready to go on when we know in our hearts that all we've really given them is a certificate of attendance. We cannot continue in that respect. That gives you the context for why it is so critically important that at the state level, there are many decisions that have to be made at the local level, but at the state level, this board has the enormous responsibility and opportunity to ensure that any student receiving a high school diploma in a public high school in Kentucky has met at the very least a basic standard, a minimum standard. Now, what districts add to that, how districts color that, how they make that their own, I encourage that. I support that. Their communities should be excited about the unique things that they are doing in their school districts. They should be able to point to profiles of graduates and say, if I graduate from a Glasgow high school, then this is what a graduate looks like here. If I graduate from Packville Independent, this is what a graduate looks like. This is what a Franklin County graduate looks like. But what I ask of this board is, regardless of the district where the kid receives that diploma, that we can ensure that that kid can read, that they can do basic math, and that they have been given something in terms of college readiness or readiness for the workforce that ensures that he or she can move on to whatever the next level of their life is going to be and be successful. That, I believe, is the authority and the responsibility that the Kentucky General Assembly has vested in the Kentucky Board of Education. It is an enormous responsibility, one that I know you take incredibly seriously. And so we want to talk a bit about the specifics of our proposal. Next slide, please. The proposed minimum high school graduation requirements are aligned to the profile of a graduate described by the many post-secondary educators and business and industry leaders across this state convened. This work happened before I got here. Some of you served on the Board of Education as this work was beginning. Some of you were part of these conversations with business and industry leaders where they told us these are the things that we want to see in a high school graduate. And frankly, these are some of the things that we are not seeing in high school graduates. These are some of our disappointments with folks who are graduating high school in Kentucky, some of the capacities, some of the skills that they lack. Is there anything that you can do at the high school level to ensure that as kids exit high school, they are in fact better prepared? And so they fit into these 5 categories. They want kids to be able to communicate. They want kids to be prepared to achieve academically, to critically think, to adapt to change, to collaborate. And as you think about these competencies, these capacities, you recognize that regardless of where a kid is heading, whether it's to Yale or to Bluegrass Community and Technical College, whether it's to the workforce directly or to the military, whether they're going to be a physician or a welder, each and every one of these are capacities that kids need to have. And so they are interwoven throughout our proposed requirements. Next slide, please. The meat of the proposal is this. Under the new requirements, students would continue to complete a minimum of 22 credit hours. The current minimum required hours is 22. We would not change that. We would not raise that. Many districts, we should note, have in fact added additional credit hour requirements onto the 22. Districts require in Kentucky as many as 26, 28 credits in some cases to graduate. So in fact, what we are establishing here is the minimum standard across the state. So we maintain 22 credits. We would require that kids are able to demonstrate foundational skills in reading and mathematics on high school assessments, with additional requirements including the completion of state science and social studies assessments, the passage of a civics test as required by statute, instruction in financial literacy as required by statute, and the demonstration of essential skills in technology, which is a part of our current requirements. What we've done with the proposed requirements is given a little bit more flesh to how districts can develop those programs to show that kids can demonstrate those capacities. Before I go further, there has been quite a bit of conversation in the last couple weeks about the requirement that kids demonstrate competence in basic reading and mathematics on foundational assessments. There's been quite a bit of misinformation. There's been quite a bit of stretching of what the research literature actually says. In communication, in communicating about what we are proposing, there's been a lot that groups across this state have left out of our proposal. So much so, I've seen some of the communication that groups have spread to some of our stakeholders, educators, parents, community, civil rights groups. I've seen some of these communications. I've heard some of these interviews. And to be frank with you, if I didn't know what our proposal actually said, and if I were relying solely on what these groups are telling me we are proposing, I wouldn't like our proposal either. Because when you talk about a proposal and you leave out key elements that do in fact align to the recommendations of the research literature, even if it's just one or two key elements, or if you don't flesh out the nuances of what the research literature actually says and you reduce it to just a sentence or a soundbite, you can use data and you can use the research literature to support your predetermined narrative. And unfortunately, rather than engage us in fruitful conversation to clarify misconceptions, that's what some of our groups have done. And so I want to be very clear about what we're proposing here. We are, in fact, proposing that we move from end-of-course assessments in Kentucky at the high school level to end-of-span assessments. By statute, the Kentucky General Assembly has given this board the authority to make that decision. You can use end-of-course assessments, as we have done in the past, or you can use end-of-span assessments. Here's why we've proposed moving from end-of-course assessments. First of all, we have immediately suspended the use of end-of-course assessments. We are not administering this year. First and foremost, because the assessments that we have used at the end-of-course level are not aligned to Kentucky academic standards. It is required by law that the assessments we give are in fact aligned to Kentucky academic standards. The ones we were administering are not. It is also required by law that the assessments that we give be developed by Kentucky teachers. The assessments, the end-of-course assessments that we have been using were not developed by Kentucky teachers. We bought those, we purchased those off the shelf. Those are two reasons. The third reason aligns with the direction we would like to go with assessment. As you'll see, and we'll talk about in the proposal, one of the things we want to do is allow greater flexibility in the courses that students take. And when you allow greater flexibility, even if you do so in minimum high school graduation requirements, you actually restrict the flexibility when you give specific end-of-course assessments. So we were only giving 4 end-of-course assessments, 1 in Algebra 2, 1 in U.S. History, 1 in Biology, and 1 in English 2. So, for example, in the proposed requirements, we are not requiring that every student in Kentucky take an Algebra 2 course. But if you administer an Algebra 2 assessment, you're requiring that students take Algebra 2. The same is true for U.S. History. We are proposing that students be able to choose 3 social studies courses that align to the Kentucky academic standards. But if you require a U.S. History end-of-course exam, you are in essence requiring that every student take U.S. History, okay? So That's the reason why we're proposing moving from EOCs to end-of-span assessments. For the reading and math assessments that students would begin to take at the end of their 10th grade year, there would be performance levels on those assessments. And let me be clear, these assessments would be developed according to Kentucky statute, just like we develop other assessments. They'd be developed by Kentucky teachers, teams of teachers that we bring together from across the state, and teams of educators would be brought in to do standard setting, where we set the performance levels on assessments, the novice, the apprentice, the novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished levels. We bring in teams of folks to help us to do that. In addition to those performance levels on the reading and mathematics foundational assessments, this board would receive a recommendation for a minimum scale score. And reaching that scale score on the reading and mathematics assessment would become a high school graduation requirement. That scale score would not be one and the same with performance levels on the assessment. I don't believe it would actually coincide perfectly with any performance level. The intent behind our proposal, and I believe our proposal states it, that we want to measure students' competence in basic reading and mathematics. And so the work we would do in standard setting and making a recommendation to you about that scale score is approximating where that level of performance is, that basic mathematics, basic reading competence level of performance is. And that would be the mark on the assessment that students would need to hit. Now, in addition to that, our proposal includes 2 alternative ways that kids can demonstrate competence in basic reading and mathematics. One of the proposals, one of the alternative routes has always been there. Mysteriously, it has not appeared in the materials that groups across the state have been circulating. But there has always been an appeals process that permitted a student who did not meet that scale score to put together a portfolio that permits them to demonstrate competence in basic reading and mathematics. They would submit that portfolio to the superintendent, the local superintendent, or the superintendent's designee for approval. The other thing that has not been noted, because that's been left out of the conversation, that appeals part has been left out of the conversation, it's also not been noted that the threats that folks have talked about in terms of the possibility of fewer students of color, fewer low-income students graduating because of an exit examination, that one of the ways to mitigate against those threats, as recommended in the research literature, is to put in place an appeals process, an alternative process that looks like the one we've proposed. The other part that's been lost in the conversation about the research literature is when you look at exit examinations and how they have existed and how they currently exist across the country, there are different categories of exit examinations. All exit examinations are not the same. And most of the conversation about what we've proposed, folks across the state, groups across the state have been describing it as a comprehensive exit examination. And it is not. When you look at the research literature, the literature actually distinguishes between comprehensive exit examinations, end of course examinations that are required for kids to be able to pass courses that are high school graduation requirements, and minimum competency examinations. What we have proposed fits most closely to what's in the research literature around minimum competency examinations. So it is not only unfair, but as a researcher, as a scholar, it would be unethical for you to take the findings of research about a sample that is not the sample that you're referencing, and then just make those findings apply to everything in a blanket fashion. Research is complicated. It's complex. You have to ask key questions about what's in the sample, what the methodologies were, and there is not any research worth its salt that can be reduced, the findings can be reduced to a bullet or a sentence. And in fact, that's probably the best indication that somebody's trying to pull the wool over your eyes, is when they say the research says, and if they can give it to you in about a sentence, they're probably hiding something. Because research is much more complicated than that. It's much more nuanced than that. Even studies that look specifically at the effect on high school graduation rates for comprehensive exit exams, which is not what we're proposing, even those findings are more nuanced than what you can put in a bullet or a sentence. It depends on the subject areas you're testing. It depends on the level at which you want students to get to. But in addition to the first appeal, where students put together a portfolio, in response to conversation with local superintendents, we have actually added an additional appeal option, and this has been in place for about a week. We sent this to local superintendents and stakeholders last week to let them know that we were adding even this additional appeals option. It is this: in addition to the portfolio appeal, a student who is unsuccessful with meeting the scale score on the reading and mathematics 10th grade examination would have the opportunity to appeal again to the local superintendent on the basis of having scored at the proficient level or higher on the 8th grade K-Prep examination. So if you put that into context, I think it gives you an idea of what the level is that we're talking about in terms of competence, basic competence in reading and mathematics. If we're going to permit students to graduate from high school after having demonstrated competence through a score of proficient or higher on the 8th grade examination, it should give you some indication that we're not looking for really high levels of achievement at the 10th grade level. Continuing with the...
Let's be clear, you're talking about proficiency based on 8th grade performance, because what we've been hearing is a 10th grade level has been the benchmark.
Yeah, that's never even been a part of our conversation.
I think, yeah.
Never even been a part of our conversation. If I had to guess where that, and Rhonda, I'm just guessing, I'm being clear. If I had to guess where that minimum scale score is going to be in terms of performance levels on that 10th grade assessment, my guess as a non-psychometrician is it probably will fall within the apprentice level on that 10th grade examination.
How do we go about determining that trigger point?
So we at the table don't actually do it. We bring in some folks who have lots of expertise in psychometrics to help us. One of the things that is essential in order to do that work is you have to have data. So the first step is we have to develop the assessment, and we develop that according to the way Kentucky statute requires that we develop assessment with teachers across the state. After we have that assessment, we actually have to administer it. And with this proposal, we'd have the opportunity to administer it at least 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
2 years.
That's right.
At least 2 years. And we'd use the data from administering the test, from students who've taken it with no stakes attached to it, to determine where that minimum level ought to be.
And then who participates in that decision-making process?
So we would bring together stakeholder groups just like we brought together stakeholder groups for standard setting with the accountability system, just like we do when we develop other assessments. That group would make a recommendation to the department, to me, and then I in turn would come and make a recommendation to you and present you with all the information. I'll tell you frankly, I will never make a recommendation to you without also telling you what alternative recommendations have been and why I might or might not have deviated from what that recommendation would be. So you would have my recommendation, you'd have that context as well, and it's a big decision, absolutely. You'd also have an idea as a part of that work of impact. We could tell you with 2 years worth of data, if we set this score, This is about how many kids would pass.
Right.
This is about how many kids wouldn't. And impact, to be frank, has to factor in to how you make the decision on where that minimum score would be.
But that projected passing rate is based on the presumption we don't do anything else.
That's
to improve
exactly
the
right.
educational process.
There is, well, at the point when I'd make a recommendation to you, it would be based on real data, the actual administration of it. But at this point, frankly, anybody who makes a projection or a guess about what percentage of our high school students would successfully graduate based on our proposed requirements, they are literally just pulling a number out of the air.
Right. Would teachers be a part of that process?
Yes, absolutely.
So one of the concerns that we had talked about in multiple board meetings, and one of my hot buttons, I know you're already smiling, is, sorry guys, as I've tried to hire people, I've found high school degrees mean less to me than GEDs. What guarantee can you have that this level of diploma is going to be at the GED level or higher? Because what we find below the GED level is just not even acceptable for entry-level positions.
This is what I would say. I don't think it would be exactly apples to apples, and here's why. In order for us to approximate the level of learning with a high school diploma across the state that you can with certainty say is someone who with a GED has, we would in fact have to administer a comprehensive exit examination. And lots of states that use exit examinations, they in fact do that. They test reading, math, English, science, social studies, or they use a battery of end-of-course assessments like the Regents examinations in the state of New York. There are so many Regents exams that you have to pass in order to get a high school diploma. So I wouldn't say what we're proposing is apples to apples, but here's what it does give you that I think is even more significant. Under our proposal, you would be assured that a kid who received a high school diploma, that they have basic skills in reading, that they have basic skills in math, and that they have demonstrated transition readiness in some respect, meaning either they have demonstrated academic readiness by meeting certain benchmarks, CPE benchmarks on the ACT, they've earned dual credit coursework, been successful in dual credit coursework, AP courses, IB courses, or on the career side, that they have earned an industry-recognized certification, not just a school-designed certification, but one that comes from industry and is validated by industry, or that they have successfully completed a work-based experience with parameters around it that we design at the department level. So I don't think, in comparison, that you would be able to have the certainty that a student has the same maybe degree of competence in science and social studies under our proposed requirement. But you would be able to say that they have basic competencies in reading and mathematics, and they've demonstrated readiness to do something next, either in college or the workforce. And the GED currently does not have the component of transition readiness requirements. So that, I believe, would be an added bonus.
So would the math and the reading be at least at the GED level?
It would not. It would not. Our proposal is basic competence in reading and mathematics. To test mathematics at the level that you would need to pass it for the GED would look more like a comprehensive exit examination with a cut score that would be considerably higher than what we would recommend to you.
Is that because we're afraid of dropping graduation rates, or, so what I have found, having taken the GED, right, is that if someone can pass a GED, I think they're competent. They can come work for us if they've got some skills that are useful. I would be concerned if we're not at least at that level.
What I hope what I hope is that we could start at a place where we could increase the expectation that every kid receiving a high school diploma has basic competence in reading and mathematics, and then, as some other states have done, routinely take a look at where that bar is and determine whether or not it's appropriate to raise that bar. I would be uncomfortable at this point making the recommendation that our bar in reading or mathematics be as high a bar as the GED examination, to be frank with you.
I'm very uncomfortable with that.
Now, the thing is, Joe, and keep this in mind, this proposal, our proposal on high school graduation requirements, is not about setting that bar, setting where that mark is going to be. What this proposal says that you guys will in fact set a bar, but we can't actually set the bar until we have developed the assessment and then administered it for 2 years to students.
Yeah, so we're 2 years away from knowing if this works.
No, we're 2 years from knowing, we're 2 years probably from setting the bar, from it being high stakes for students. The first students actually for whom this proposal would apply, I believe, is the class of 2023?
2020, it's the
Because it's freshmen entering fall 2020.
Yes, so 2023, that's right.
2023.
Graduates of 2023.
Graduate 2024, that's right.
And I think, as I understand it,
That's right.
the first exam that has a consequence is 3.5 years from now.
And I understand we can't change what we have now, right? And oh, by the way, I think the numbers are actually off when you said 35% are not college or career ready, right? Because we left off the 10% that didn't graduate. So it's almost half the people that have started high school don't have any skills that are transferable to their future,
Yes, sir.
right?
You're
And-
right.
And I get it, you can't flip a switch and make it right, but I think we ought to set the bar at a level, or we need to make sure we all understand where the bar is and what the impact is for Kentucky and what the timeline is for making that difference. Once again, can't flip a switch and change everything, but we all have to be moving the right direction.
There are a couple of other things that are relevant to that, too. One is in the chart that you showed about the earnings of people at the certificate level, the 2-year level. Even the highest category on that, which was about $30,000 for a 4-year college graduate, is only marginally above the federal poverty level for a family of 4.
That's right.
I think the other part that would be interesting to have in that information is what the upside is for the people in those 3 categories, because you not only start out with more, but you have a much different curve shape depending on the amount of education you have. And I think we need to recognize that when we consider the facts in trying to come up with a solution. I'd also be interested in knowing your analysis of why the numbers that you showed on K-Prep and even maybe not ACT, but on K-Prep and NAEP break down the way they do. I think a lot of people agree that it's not because the people in these different cohorts can't learn the same way. And if it's not, what's your take on what it is?
So the first question would require some additional work, and we'll absolutely do that.
I think it would be a lot more informative, and it would be a lot more dramatic in showing what the differences are.
Yes, sir. In terms of my assessment, in terms of why those numbers are the way they are, I think it's complex. I I break down achievement in terms of thinking of what the levers are on student achievement into the three big categories of what we do at the school level, what we do at home, and community factors. I think all of those factor in. The research has been really pretty clear. I mean, when we talk about educational research, and Gary, I'll look to you for your thoughts on this as well as a research colleague. When we talk about the change, the degree of influence we can have at the school level on academic achievement, I do not believe that the degree of change we can have on academic achievement at the school level is greater than the degree of change we can have in academic achievement with a substantial change in what's going on at home and the home situation. I do believe home is an even bigger lever for academic achievement than what we can adjust at the school level.
Trying to figure that out, it would be interesting if we had numbers on what the difference is in the educational level of the parents in the different demographics.
And we do know from the research literature that there is correlation between parents and family income and academic achievement. There's correlation between parents' education level and academic achievement as well.
Things may be related.
They are. Not one and the same, but absolutely related. The other part, though, that we also know, and there are proof points of this across the country, and to be clear, for folks who would make assumptions about what I'm saying, there are proof points across the country in traditional public schools, in magnet schools, in the charter school sector, and in the private school sector. There are examples of schools that use approaches that cater more specifically to the populations of students that they serve, who are having the types of gains and results with low-income kids and with kids of color, where more traditional approaches are not moving the needle. I mean, there are proof points, and so the idea that it can't be done or that we don't know how to do it is not in fact true. We do know how to do it. We do know that while home life matters a lot, and while community variables matter a lot, there are in fact approaches, there are educators, there are strategies that we can use that are currently being used in low income and communities of color across our country that are moving the needle. And folks have labeled me, you know, as a charter school advocate. I read the newspaper in Lexington most often, and it's really kind of comical to me now. Every time the Herald Leader refers to me, they call me charter school advocate Wayne Lewis, discounting the fact that I've actually never worked in a charter school, or that I've spent my entire career in public education and public post-secondary institutions, and that's primarily where my work has been, but I'm a charter school advocate. With that said, charter school sector is only one of the sectors where we know innovative approaches that stretch the boundaries, that people that realize that you can't treat every kid alike, depending on their needs, depending on their circumstances. If you live in a community where you walk down the block to get to school every day and you might have to duck from gunfire, it's very different when everybody kind of walks to school and rides their bike and you don't have to worry about getting shot on the way to school. It's very different. It's a very different situation than when you don't have, you know, floors, you know, at home, or running water in your house, or if you don't have a kitchen table to do your homework. And so the approaches that we use in school have to, in fact, be more responsive to the specific individual unique needs that kids bring to school. I would argue that our approach as educators would be unethical, not just inappropriate, but unethical, to treat kids, if we use it in a clinical sense, to treat kids like they are all middle-class kids with two parents at home to help them with homework. It is unethical to assume that or to teach that way when we know, in fact, that for many of our kids, that's not their reality. And so the schools, the approaches, the strategies that are, in fact, meeting the needs, they recognize the fact that kids come with different needs, and they adapt what they're doing significantly to meet those needs.
So Commissioner Lewis, you bring up all these great points. The 100% valid. You can't treat all of them the same. The issue I think that we're discussing is where is the bar set?
Oh, absolutely. I was responding to Ben's question.
I'm with you, and so I wanted to make sure we're dealing with the bar, because if we're not saying someone is going to be able to be employed or be a part of society in a positive way because they don't meet, the testing levels need to be at the bar that says I can get a job, I can be a benefit to society. If we're setting it up so that it's less than that, and I know I don't have the years and the PhD that you and your staff have. I have the common sense, practical approach that says I'm trying to hire people and pay them $15, $20 an hour, and I can't find people with the skill sets.
No, I do believe, Joe, to clarify on your point, our proposal, I believe, I have complete confidence that with the requirements that we are proposing, a student graduating would be, in fact, prepared to go to work and contribute in the workforce. Now, it may not be, quite frankly, at a $15 or $20 an hour job, but we could be assured that the student has earned on the career readiness side, has some type of credential, some type of training that equips them to go into the workforce. I'll give you an example. One of those might be an M&A program, medical nurse aid program, where a student could go into a CNA job. They could exit with that credential, which would mean that they are transition ready. And if they have demonstrated basic competence in reading and mathematics, I would feel confident at the very least that they have the minimum foundational skills necessary to continue to learn. That's why the basic reading and mathematics is so important. Some superintendents asked us, why don't you just focus on transition readiness? Why do you need the marker to ensure that everybody has the basic reading and mathematics? And it is because if you don't have skills in basic reading and mathematics, you can't go beyond just that initial job, that initial certification. So the basic skills, for me, is not about a high level of achievement in reading and mathematics. It's ensuring that kids at least have the foundational level so that they can continue to learn, to adapt, because as we know, the workforce changes, the economy changes, and the jobs that they're likely to go into, even at $9 or $10 an hour, if that's where they start, those jobs very well might not exist in another 5 to 10 years. So I am confident that under the proposal, kids would be much better prepared and, in fact, equipped to enter the workforce and to take care of themselves, not necessarily, depending on their route, in today's dollars in a $15 to $20 an hour job, but in a $9 to $10 an hour job at the very least.
So, and this will be my last comment, I promise, at least for 10 minutes. I think the bar is being moved the right direction, right? There's no question of that. The question is, if you look at what it takes to survive on your own, right? $13 an hour is like the break even between, should I stay on welfare and get all the assistance, or can I, support a family and move forward? So to me, the bar would be, we have to prepare people at least to that level, right? So that they're independent. And I know, once again, you can't just change it, but we can't set the bar too low, and there's going to be negative impact to it, but we have to help people move forward.
There's going to be some impact regardless of how far we move the bar. The concern I would have with moving it that degree is I think the impact would be too great. So I don't disagree with you at all about where the bar should be. I do think that's where the bar should be. The only place where I'm probably not quite where you are is I think there are probably some steps that we have to take to get there. I don't know that we can go from where we are now in the numbers that I showed you today to go immediately there.
Joe, I would just say, from my own personal experience, my own perspective, if you have people working for you now that only have a high school education, the chances are many of them are proficient only at the 8th grade level, yet they're very productive for you. If you go back, if you administered a GED to everybody working for you now that only has a high school education, even though they're working productively for you, chances are they're going to have a tough time passing it. Many of them will, yet they're still there and they're still productive.
They probably will. The thing that I look at is, as we are moving forward so quickly in technology, it just scares me. It scares me for my children, right? What are they going to be doing, right? I've got a son studying robotics, right? The stuff he's doing. I'm an engineer. I'm like, holy cow, that's really cool. I never thought of doing that. Right? So I just really want to make sure we're setting Kentucky up for as much success as we can.
I think it's really important that we have a conversation about where that bar should be set, because I think that's where part of the controversy over this proposal has come from, in terms of a concern that in setting it too high, we were going to do some serious damage to kids, and maybe in a disproportional way to really vulnerable student groups. But what's even more important than the conversation about where to set the bar is that we're setting a bar to start with, right? Yes. That to me is the essence of this proposal. And it's helpful, I think, to think about why we are doing this, right? Because I don't think any of us would suggest that this component, this minimum competency component of the graduation requirement, is by itself going to have some enormous impact on long-term student outcomes, right? It'll take that in conjunction with a lot of other variables. But what this component of the proposal does is add value and more meaning to the high school diploma as it now exists. And that is worth doing in and of itself, because currently we don't have a minimum competency bar built into the system at all.
I think it's worth noting, I mean, this is not a new problem. I mean, this lack of competency, graduating students that are only 50% of whom are competent in math and reading, or less, even a 25% in the minority community in some cases. This has been going on for years. And as a native Kentuckian, as a graduate of Kentucky Public Schools and college educated in Kentucky, I think it's Kentucky's shame that we have allowed this to go on as long as we have, without people shouting from the rooftops that this is unacceptable. I don't know where the education community, the education establishment, the education advocates, some of whom are in this room, where they've been. Why are we just now confronting this issue? Why, this has been going on for years. And how many young lives, how many young futures have we sacrificed at the altar of adult convenience because we didn't want to vigorously attack this problem? I think that's Kentucky's shame.
And if you look at the impact question, in order to influence where you set the bar, part of the impact question is the question of how far behind we've gotten over the last 50 years. one reason the impact is so scary is because we're in such horrible shape to start with.
That's right.
And reasonable people could disagree about whether it's worth throwing away the next 8 classes in order to do that gradually, or whether you may have to leave some people behind in that process in order to get the bar where it should have been 25 years ago.
Board, we've been going for about an hour and a half with the panel. At some point here, would like to move into discussion on the item in particular after it's on our floor here. I don't know if there's any more questions here for the panel. Obviously, Dr. Lewis is a member of this, is on this board and can continue to answer questions. But at some point here, I'd like to get into more detailed examination of this, of the item. I do have one item that hasn't received much question yet, and that is on feedback you're getting from superintendents on the transition readiness components. We've talked a lot about the competency component, but the transition readiness, a sense of what the department is hearing on the transition readiness component.
Sure, I'll start and then I'll ask my colleagues to give what they've been hearing as well. In general, conversations that I've had with superintendents have been relatively supportive of the transition readiness requirement. The most frequent question I receive from superintendents around the transition readiness requirement is an equity question. Is considering, depending on the district where you are, the number of routes to transition readiness, especially on the career readiness side, that might be available to students. And frankly, that is a legitimate question. We do have to ensure that regardless of where a kid is going to school, regardless of the district, that there are in fact multiple ways that kids can demonstrate transition readiness. Now, we will never get to the place where every route to career readiness is available at every high school or in every district. We simply will not. Even within some of our most well-funded districts, all of these routes are not available to every student. What I do believe is an appropriate goal is to say that kids have multiple ways to get there. But colleagues, what are you hearing?
So one of the things that we addressed last week in better clarity, David and Wayne and I did, is with our students with disabilities. We wanted to ensure there was equitable access also for students with significant cognitive disabilities that aren't in the 1% range. And so we had some really great feedback and consideration from the State Advisory Council, which I had mentioned before, and we talked also to some directors of special education and worked with career and technical education to ensure that the language around the work-based experiences, the exceptional work experience, really allowed for the annual review committee, or what we call the ARC, to make appropriate decisions for students with disabilities to ensure that they receive their services and still have the opportunity to build working skills that would be appropriate. And so we've worked through those to provide better clarity around that. Also, we got feedback around the academic readiness with students with disabilities to ensure that the ARC still had the decision-making capabilities for the student to ensure that there was equitable access. So we did need to clarify that language, and we did so. That was really important for us to ensure that all students had opportunities. So that was the only thing outside of what Dr. Lewis has brought up as being concerns. I don't know.
I was going to say, I think my conversations are very similar to what the commissioner has heard. I think more folks that I deal with are just thinking about what can we offer. And I think they like the idea of the flexibility, that there's more than one way to demonstrate that you're academic or career ready. But I think and again, a number of people have invested heavily in dual credit, which is not in the system this year. So that's probably been our most common comment. But
well, and I think at when we presented to the local superintendent's advisory committee, they did make the point that they were very happy with the flexibility on the career side. There's about 5 different ways to demonstrate career readiness.
So I would say 5 different ways to demonstrate it, and within one, the industry recognized certifications, we offer over 150.
Right.
And within another, the exceptional work experience category, it's open-ended in terms of the number of ways. So 5 kind of routes, but within some of those routes, even the dual credit route, tremendous numbers of ways that kids can actually do it.
And the exceptional experience route is one that is not only intended for the groups that she talked about, but if I'm in an area that I don't have training to become an electrician, I could go out in business and industry and get that exceptional experience if it weren't available to me in the high school.
And I do know I've heard some since we've had, actually today's the 3rd reading, I think, but we added an extra reading in there somehow. But I know at least one district, maybe others, already have their own transition readiness requirements and have achieved
That's right.
success with it. I know we heard, an award-winning Western Kentucky district, or actually individuals that business person working with, I think Fulton, Hickman, those counties, some of those schools are already achieving 100% of the students, or 98% or
College
something,
and career
achieving
readiness.
dual credit.
Yes, right.
So we know it can, there's lots of bright spots in the state, there really is, and taking those ideas here and incorporating it in this reg to be phased in over time.
And the question, Mr. Chair, that we have to continue to ask ourselves, and I would suggest it ought to be the first question. It tends to be the second question. The first question tends first to be, how will this impact schools' accountability? And that is a worthwhile question and consideration. And so I will not discount the importance of that calculation for superintendents and for districts. I would suggest, however, the first question ought to be, if we don't set a bar, how will this impact kids' lives? If kids continue to exit our system without being transition readiness and or demonstrating basic competence, what will happen to those kids?
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Lewis, this career readiness, as we sit here and we're all talking about changing at the bar, I think about the medical profession, I think about the doctors. They are continuously learning, and that's the same way what I see with the school system. We're 50 years out and we're behind, okay, and things are continually happening. Our children are now getting tablets and everything else at school. And to stay continually ready to set a bar in a permanent position, how are we going to continually to move, because the world is continually changing. Our progress in our society and our technology is continually changing. And for the child that started last week or getting ready to start the school, we've got to continually be ready for the new advancement that are continually coming. Joe was talking about the robots, his son in engineering. We all got to realize that because you got a master or a doctor in this particular field, that field has changed in the last 20 years, the continuation of education also. And that's what I'm looking at. We're bringing people from other countries here to keep this country running. And I'm asking the question this morning, as we continually change, are we going to continually move this bar and make sure that we're prepared from generation to generation?
I think you are 100% right. The decision that the board will make and the decisions you'll make in the next couple months are decisions, Reverend Seymour, that I think this board and future boards should continue to revisit. We should not, and frankly, there should not have been as long a period since the board took such a critical look at our high school graduation requirements. There's been kind of tinkering around the edges, and we've kind of played around with it, but at the rate at which our economy is moving, at which technology is moving, you are absolutely right. I think it would be incumbent upon this board and future state boards of education to continue to monitor, to assess whether the bar we have for high school graduation appropriately aligns with the demands and the expectations of both post-secondary education and the workforce.
I have to be honest with you, I'm not totally comfortable with this idea of transition readiness. Some of it seems pretty fuzzy, particularly the exceptional work requirement. I know, David, you sent me an example, but Amanda, I couldn't get any firm guidelines from you as to what constitutes exceptional work experience and other things as well. I don't know that it's our role to certify that someone is suitable to become a productive member of society. I think that's a little bit of government overreach. I think our fundamental job as educators is to bring kids to proficiency in English and math and the basic academic areas that are necessary. To go beyond that, I think, is pretty big jump right now. If we just educate kids to proficiency, that is a huge leap from what we're doing right now.
I guess the question would be, though, Rich, what are, in the year 2018, in the 21st century, what are those basic academic areas?
Well, I think we've identified them in the proficiency requirements.
So I don't know that in 2018, the basic academic areas are the same that they were 50 years ago. And I'll give you case in point. We talk about, in general, if you think even about science or mathematics, the core areas, right? The core areas in science and in mathematics. I think in 2018, coursework in statistics or coursework in computer science and computer literacy are in some ways more fundamental and more applicable to kids being successful both at the post-secondary level and in the workforce than some of the courses that we continue to require and consider staples.
Yeah, but the basics as they're defined right now set the stage for that kind of academic growth later on. But I think if we go beyond basic academic education and heap these other responsibilities onto the schools, I'm afraid I fear that that's too big of a jump right now.
I think we should keep in mind, though, Rich, that we're already there. Whether the State Board of Education makes the decision or not to adopt transition readiness as part of high school graduation requirements, transition readiness is in law. You already hold districts.
So the schools and the institutions accountable.
You hold districts accountable to some degree in the accountability system for getting kids transition
To
ready.
certify that an individual is or is not ready to become an acceptable member of society, I don't think that is our purview.
And I don't think that's our proposal. That's not our proposal. It is that we are preparing kids, though, to do something next. Whether that's to go to college, 2-year, 4-year, to go into the workforce. Because the reality is 40% of our kids right now don't go on to continue their learning. And so if our only bar, if the only thing we're going to pay attention to in this economy is fundamental stuff like reading and mathematics, I don't believe we've appropriately prepared those kids for the world as it is today.
Let me ask you then, suppose a student wants to become a stay-at-home full-time parent with the other parent earning the living, supporting the family. We used to consider that an honorable outcome. Is that person considered a failure now because they haven't gone into college or a career?
Absolutely not. But here's what I would say about that person. That person, as a student, has no idea, one, if they're going to be married, or if they're going to have a spouse that's able to prepare to take care of them. So yes, I think that's an honorable outcome, and many Kentuckians across the Commonwealth perform that for their families. But I think we would be negligent in our responsibilities as a public education system if that person were not prepared to be able to take care of themselves, regardless of whether they end up married to someone who is capable of taking care of them and their family.
Well, I still think that basic academic proficiency, as you have outlined it here in your proposal, which I think is outstanding, and it's a huge leap forward from the quagmire that Kentucky education has been in for years now.
And maybe, Rich,
I think that sets the stage for these other things you're talking about.
maybe I would feel different if what I proposed was actually basic academic proficiency. But keep in mind, it's not.
Well, we haven't really set those bars yet.
Yeah, but my proposal is not basic academic proficiency. It is minimum competency in mathematics and reading. So maybe if the bar were basic proficiency in mathematics and in reading, to be frank, I would feel more confident that if that alone were the bar, kids would be prepared to go on and be successful. But that's not what we're proposing.
Well, I like your portfolio proposal as an option. Interestingly, Fulton County, I was talking with their superintendent yesterday, has a requirement, currently a requirement, that in order to graduate, you must basically do an oral in front of the educators, top educators in that system, and convince them you are ready for the next step. You are ready for adulthood, basically.
Yeah.
And something like that, I think, is an option as well.
Yeah, and we have some of our districts across the state are doing that. I've served on advisory council for a while, actually since its opening in Scott County at Elkhorn Crossing School. And so once every semester, community members come in, advisory councils come in, and they do those types of presentations. We do have those types of things, which I think are really positive, happening across the Commonwealth.
Commissioner, can you talk about districts that have already voluntarily adopted transition readiness as a graduation requirement and how that speaks to this particular issue?
I do. I don't want to misspeak. So the only place I know for sure that has adopted it is at Franklin Simpson High. And Shelby County has adopted it as well.
Bullitt did for a while.
Bullitt has as well. And I believe some variation of it, the Board of Education in Woodford County has adopted as well. So this will not be a new concept across the state. It would be new to require across the board. But again, it's one of those things where you would require transition readiness across the board, but all told, literally provide hundreds of options for kids to demonstrate it.
So Commissioner Lewis, what's the difference between minimum requirements and basic proficiency? How big of a step is that?
Well, when we say basic proficiency in terms of, or proficiency, and Rhonda is really good with making sure that I don't say proficiency, because when we say proficiency in an academic, in an assessment vein, we are talking about a performance level, a specific performance level on the assessment. And in general, it's not a perfect correlation, but it's about where we would equate to be at grade level. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's about at grade level.
So if someone graduated, they would be at the 12th grade level if they were basically proficient.
There's a different kind of metric when you're looking at grade level standards, so I probably technically wouldn't say it that way. I will say that when we put the cut in for proficiency, we looked at linking to standards. So you've brought up the ACT several times today, Ben. When we set those original cuts to proficiency, we actually linked up to what the cut score of CPE would be expected for the ACT. So we did correlations to link that up. So I would say proficiency is a high standard. It's a high expectation. And obviously, we want all of our students to reach proficiency. But I think what we're talking about around the idea of passing is something below that, considerably below that, more of the minimum.
I completely understand. I'm just trying to figure out, all right, if having 3 children, right, I want to make sure that I am not paying for the rest of their lives for them to survive, right? So what level, and Commissioner Lewis, you have a daughter, what level would you want your daughter to reach to graduate? And does this minimum requirement where you would be happy with it?
No. For my daughter, no.
Okay, so then why are we happy for other people's children?
You know, and I would not say, to be frank, Joe, I would not say that I would be happy for any child in the Commonwealth to meet the bare minimum requirement. I wouldn't be happy for my daughter. I wouldn't be happy for anyone. I do think, though, I do believe it would be inappropriate for me to think, to believe that the minimum standard for any student in Kentucky receiving a high school diploma is the same expectation that I would have for my daughter. Because to be frank, my daughter is incredibly privileged in comparison to
So are my kids, I get it.
in
Yeah.
comparison to kids across the Commonwealth. And so I have a higher expectation for her because of the privilege that she has.
So there's a great book, The Other Westmoreland.
Joe, if we could, so today, we're not really trying to
Sorry.
set the
I'll be
bar.
quiet.
Sort of the discussion today is focused on, should there be a bar at all in Kentucky, a minimum bar for graduation? Today, there is none, other than completion of courses, and we've heard some conversation about that. But the focus of this is, should there be a bar? And then we'll have, before the first, on the proficiency side, before the first time that there is an exam that has any consequence in that student's life, although they can take it multiple times over and over and over, but that first exam is 3.5 years from now. So this would begin the process of, again, public hearings, reconsideration by this board again in December, and then over the next at least 2 years or so, 2 or 3 years, educators, teachers put the assessments together, full discussion and review of where that minimum bar. But our focus today is, should there be a bar at all? And to graduate from high school. Wanted to mention on one other topic, and that is sort of the changing nature of the world and why I personally think this is important. I know when I, a long time ago, graduated from high school, I saw a report that said, for my graduating class, I think the number was about 73%, about 3/4 of the students with a high school diploma were equipped to go on to a decent life, a good life. I mean, to get a job. Low-skilled jobs were, quite frankly, abundant, and with diligence, move forward. The economy we find ourselves in today, that 73%, if that number in that report was correct, that 73% number, if I use a number that an assistant secretary, Department of Labor, that came here to Kentucky a year or so ago talked about, is now in the low 20s, 21, 22% or so of the jobs are low-skilled jobs. So there's a really big difference, and we're a big middle skill state. It takes a skill, it takes some post-secondary, it takes a credential in order to be able to support yourself, as you did back in the 70s and 80s. There's been an economic, and I know this board knows that, but a huge economic shift in the ability of that student to be able to support themselves. Hence the focus on dual credit, and I know it's just taking off in an almost vertical line in the state right now. As parents understand the importance of that next step, whether it's in a career area, whether it's in healthcare or IT or construction trades, all of those areas where there's an abundance of jobs, it's just zooming. And what this, as I see the transition readiness, is just a support for really where our school systems are headed right now, the importance of where we're going. But I do think there's a difference today in a student being prepared when they graduate high school than when I graduated high school. And if we're ready to go into discussion, I think maybe we could thank the panel for 2 hours. And then Commissioner Lewis, obviously as a member of this body, could join us in discussion. And I would entertain a motion for approval of this regulation, if we had one.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion second, and correct me if I'm wrong, for approval of this proposed regulation, 704 KAR 3305, the amendment to that, minimum high school graduation requirements. And we have a first and second, and now we are in discussion on that item. I would like to bring before you a proposed amendment. A lot of it's just clarification amendments to the regulation that's currently posted. I believe there are 4 of them. One is on page 6, if you're following along. Page 6, line 4, it says, this is in the proficiency section, meet minimum criteria on the reading and mathematics assessments. I would suggest we add there a comma and then say, which will approximate basic competence in reading and mathematics. Obviously, the definition of basic competence will be developed with teams of educators across the state, but just to be clear where we are headed on this item.
We'd be supportive of that, Mr. Chair.
Okay. The second, and a couple of these are just cleanup items that, on page 7, line 14, it references foundational requirements. This is really just a typo item, but it says section 4, subparagraph 4. That should say subparagraph 5. Make sure it's referring to the correct paragraph. Page 8, line 16. Again, a typo item, but it says item 2A. It should actually be a 7A to, again, direct to the correct area. And then just a clarifying item at the end of section 4, this would be page 9, would come between line 15 and 16, just because as we read through section 4, was concerned that there, was concerned about clarity. So it suggests adding this sentence as item 8 that says, the provisions of section 4 found in subsections 3 through 6 shall apply to all students covered by subsections 1 and 2 of section 4. Somebody could have read that possibly that this 1 year of students that have transition readiness only, but not transition readiness and competency, that maybe some of those sections didn't apply on the flexibility for the 22 credit hours. So just to make it crystal clear for that one class.
At the end of line 15, shouldn't that be a period instead of a comma?
This is on page 9.
Yes.
Okay, my copy has a period.
Yeah.
I think. But, yep. Maybe that is a comma. It's hard.
Looks like.
Where are my glasses? Yeah. But yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah. But right after that, we would add subparagraph 8 that just makes it real clear that the students in this 1 year of transition readiness alone, that all of the academic flexibility that's being provided for them in direction and getting their 22 credit hours applies to them also, not just students coming in 2020. And I'd accept a motion for approval of that amendment, if you're comfortable with that.
One other thing I wanted to suggest here in terms of amendments might be on page 7, section G, this is on line 10. This is where we're identifying the credit requirements for the different subject areas. Is there value in where it says history and appreciation of visual and performing arts? Is there value in just calling that visual and performing arts, which incorporates sort of the history and appreciation of that's kind of like a course title or a subset of the visual and performing arts. And I think it might better represent the breadth of courses that are available here. I know we've got or another arts course which incorporates, but
We can just say.
I'm not sure we would even need that
Yeah.
if we just called it
See what you're
visual and
saying.
performing arts.
Great.
Yep,
Yes, sir.
that makes sense.
So we'd be striking history and appreciation of?
Yep.
Yeah, and I'd accept that in my amendment.
Yeah. So with that, I would make a motion to approve the amendments that Hal has offered here, including the note about visual and performing arts.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and second. Any discussion on the amendment? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no? Okay, passes unanimously. All right, we have this amended regulation as amended by the board here the last 2 minutes ago is before us for discussion.
I have to say, I am, from all of our prior conversations, prior meetings, the question had been brought forward, will our graduation requirements be tougher than a GED? And to hear today that the answer is no means I'm going to have a tough time supporting this. I know we're setting the bar later, so I'd like to understand when that bar is going to be set.
And Joe, to be clear, my response wasn't no. My response was the requirements are different than that of a GED. So in comparison, if you want to compare the requirements for, or the expectation for demonstrating competence in reading and mathematics to demonstration in reading and mathematics, then yes. The answer is yes. It is a higher standard. The GED is a higher standard than what we would propose. Obviously, the board sets that. We'll set that at a future date, but we would propose it be a lower standard. But the other part of that is the transition readiness requirement component of this requirement is a requirement that the GED does not have. And so I wouldn't say no. I would say the expectation and the requirements are different than that of the GED.
And the other question I would have is if you looked at the top states' educational systems, what is their grade level graduation performance? So Massachusetts, New Jersey. I was sat next to a lady on an airplane. She said Iowa used to have really good schools. I don't know that for a fact, but so when they graduate, what level are they at? What grade level graduation rate would they be at? Are they 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade?
I don't know if given the assessments that they take, we can say that. I mean, the better approximations, the best approximations I think we get with comparing our students' academic performance or academic preparedness would be looking at something like college admissions examinations and then talking about the percentage of students that are at ACT benchmark or even CPE benchmark.
But that's so skewed because some states, everyone takes it, some states just college students.
That's right.
So I don't know how to.
That's exactly right. And
look at that.
so you would have to compare us only to states where everybody takes it, because it would be skewed if you compared us to a state where everybody doesn't take the college admissions.
So where would these graduation requirements put us in the rank of 50 states? Is it mid-pack, low-pack, upper side?
I don't think I could do it, but I can tell you we've looked quite a bit at Massachusetts. I don't know that what we are proposing, to be frank, is as rigorous as what Massachusetts requires. I don't think it's as rigorous as what New York requires. I can tell you that down the road, tougher requirements for graduation are where I would like to get to. It is not my desire whatsoever that what the board would adopt in the next couple months should be Kentucky's graduation requirement going into the future. My hope is that the board will set a new expectation for high school graduation, that our districts and our schools will reach for that bar and in fact surpass that bar, and then it'll be time to inch that requirement up a little bit more, because I don't think what we're proposing should be the end place, because I think you're absolutely right that the bar we're proposing does not really align, appropriately align, or perfectly align with the expectations and demands of post-secondary education of the workforce. What I believe they do, though, is they get us closer there.
I think it's a great step. What it would take for me to feel really comfortable about this would be a timeline to say, we're going to raise the bar this year, this year, this year, and here's where the bar ultimately needs to be, right?
Commissioner, will you tell us when will the level of the bar for this 2024 class, when will that bar likely come to the board for review?
So Rhonda, we have an RFP already ready.
Out. It's out.
To go out.
It's already out.
When will we start development of the assessment?
We'll have to have the contract fully in place, and we'll have to start the development using our current standards because we're also under standard revision. So we would hope to do some field testing of items, look also at our existing items we own. We have banks of items that have been created by Kentucky teachers. So we would have to start that work toward doing some field testing in the spring of 19 is the goal. So this spring, we'd start to do field testing, but giving an operational test then in the spring of 20 and another operational test in the spring of 21. So you would have 2 years of sort of full data by the time we got to sort of the summer of 21.
And I would anticipate then how we would have a recommendation to you all for a minimum cut score then in the fall, probably early fall of 2021.
Okay, so 3 years from now, it would come back to the board to set what that bar level is.
It just makes me ill.
I just gave him a copy of the Massachusetts requirements. They require a score of 240 on the MCAS test, whatever that is. I assume it's their
That's their state assessment. So it'd be like saying
where that
K-Prep
would
for
line up,
Kentucky.
There's Massachusetts assessment is a comprehensive exit examination. So again, remember the conversation we've had. People have likened what we're proposing to a comprehensive exit examination. It is not.
Right.
That is what Massachusetts administers.
Well, I will vote in favor of this regulation, mainly to move it on for further public discussion and input. I'd like to see a vigorous and rational discussion on the merit of transition readiness and also whether how well it aligns with the intent of Senate Bill 1 as well. But I think that's got to be an important part of this as well.
Kathy?
Yes, and I know we're at the end of this discussion, but we are being asked to be honest, and I share a lot of Joe's concerns. I love the fact that we are going towards some accountability, which we don't have now. That is huge, and if that is the only incremental step we can take, so be it. But I have to ask the question, and Gary brought this up in his comments, is what damage is being inflicted that isn't already being inflicted by our calling a spade and saying that we have to have these high standards, but what damage that are we fearing by having a higher standard? And why are we having to be so incrementally slow? Because all we're doing is exposing something that is already happening every single day to the kids here.
The thing is, and this is the reason for my recommended approach with not going all the way to where we believe we need to be. With setting the standard, I do believe there has to be a reasonable time period to give educators the opportunity to get kids to the standard. Because the purpose for raising the standard is not that we would have lots of kids not graduating. It's in fact that we could get as close to our high school graduation rate as we are currently. The likely scenario is that we will have some dip, but we don't want there to be a significant dip. The rationale for me for raising the standard is that educators will step up, our public education system will step up and will help kids to get there. I firmly believe, whether it's at the student level, the classroom level, the school level, part of the reason why we have not reached the bar, part of it is because we have not set it at the appropriate level. But if we set it too far beyond where we are, beyond the point where educators feel like, or our system believes they have the time and the capacity to get there, I do think we'd run the risk of inflicting damage.
So I would like to know what is going to change then for them with whatever the barriers are that they're currently facing to have already achieved these things. What is systemically changing
I
other than we're setting the bar?
Well, I believe there's power in accountability, Kathy. I really do. That is not to say that there are not other things that we have to do in terms of increasing our capacity at the individual, at the school level, and at the system level, that there aren't strategic investments that need to be made to provide our schools and our kids with the types of opportunities and the routes that are necessary. I think all of those things are important, and I would never suggest that just setting the bar alone will get us there. With that said, I believe setting the bar is powerful. It's been my experience, and this is documented in the literature as well, whether you're talking about individual kids or systems. Raising the bar, setting the bar changes performance. It's the case for me. Accountability changes my performance. I think it changes all of our performance at the individual level. And I think a key part of us changing the educational outcomes that we talked about this morning is accountability in our public education system from the top to the bottom. I say all the time, from the commissioner to the classroom teacher, there has to be accountability for changing educational outcomes.
Well, and I think to me, in this kind of slow tick up of, our accountability system, so to speak, we also will allow time once that accountability has been enforced to have that earlier intervention we're all striving for, right?
That's
I mean,
right.
right now, the kids that we're going to be applying this to, we've kind of, so to speak, missed our mark for that early intervention space. So to me, it makes sense.
Yeah, so
Do it this way.
so the first kids for whom this assessment would be high stakes are our current 7th graders.
Right.
So I think there's impact already, even with this conversation, even before this board makes a decision. I think we know across our system that the bar is getting ready to change. And I think it impacts our behavior. I think it changes how, it makes us much more intentional about the fact that we know kids are going to have to demonstrate minimum competency in reading and mathematics. And I think our system is going to respond appropriately.
Wayne, so
Really,
we,
they have. Since 2009, 2010, we had never even talked about college and career readiness. We talked about graduation, and we weren't focused on all. And so really since 2009, 2010, with that Senate Bill 1, 2009, we started to change conversation around college and career readiness. And so you saw an incredible uptick really on that all students were administered the ACT, and that was very controversial then. And so giving access and expecting all, not some, to go to college, but for all to have a path, to have some type of plan after they leave high school has changed conversation. And I think we're at a new place, we're at a new bar, because in 2010 we weren't even talking about where they were leaving us after high school graduation. We were just getting them to graduate. So we have made progress, and I don't think they're just sitting and not doing. I think we are trying to raise the bar to go even further, because there is merit in preparing kids. And one of the things, Rich, I'm sorry you did not get what you needed on that, but really it was being developed through career and technical education around the exceptional work experience of setting very clear parameters about what that should look like. So there are parameters around that. But a piece of that, when we were talking about the transition readiness and the accountability system, when we had all of our shareholders in the room with us going through this, it was very heated discussion, but we said just an ACT score is not helping kids sustain in school. That's not enough. Or just having a pathway with just some people shoving some kids in the same pathway. That's not what our intention was. So that's where we came up with the options with the help of the shareholders at the table, with business and industry, with post-secondary ed, saying what will help. And what we looked at specifically when we talked about the academic readiness, the combination of dual credit and advanced placement courses, specifically before we even engaged with IB and Cambridge, is that with that combination and their exposure to high-level classroom experiences and vocabulary and the expectation of college-level courses, and with the college entrance exam, and those combination pieces is what helps students sustain longer. And then with the career readiness, there's so many more options in the promotion of the apprenticeships. It wasn't just a pathway where they couldn't get out of it, but really what were those options, because we need more than just those pieces. And so that's why that got expanded, because we want them to be prepared when they walk across our stage that there's meaning. Even if they choose to stay home, they have skills and credentials if they choose to do something different, or if their children are in school and they go to school, or they go into work their skills. And so we want our students to walk across the stage with meaning. and that they have additional skill set outside of just the bare minimum. That's where a lot of that came from. But I don't think we should lose sight of the progress we have made, because we really weren't talking about this 8 or 9 years ago. And when we started talking about having kids ready for college or career, that was like, what do you mean by that? And we even at the elementary level started going, what do we mean by that? So when I see the 8th grade data that was shared yesterday by Rhonda, those students were first graders when they were introduced to new standards, immediately introduced to new standards, along with all the other changes we were enduring. So these kids have had a solid set of standards for the last 8 years that have pushed teachers and administrators to think very differently and to approach instruction very differently. It just takes some time.
Amanda,
And so,
I understand. Yeah, we're administering ACTs. We made all of these moves. Those are all inputs.
yes.
But the outputs haven't moved. The results are basically the same.
Well, we're assessing all, though.
That's what all of this should be leading to, is an improvement in the output, an improvement in
Should.
the end result that we deliver.
Should. But our whole conversation has changed, and I do think we have a lot of work to do, and that's where I like the point of the accountability piece, not as in big A test all the time, but just being held accountable for student learning at all levels, right? Not just at the end.
So the 2-second summary of what I've heard is 8th grade level is the threshold, right, for minimum requirements. And we have 4 years of high school to get them to the 8th grade level.
That's right.
That's a head shake yes.
That is what we're saying.
Okay, and what we're saying is there's 2 math requirements and I think 2 English requirements, or you have to take 2, there's 4, but there's 2 that you have
Yes,
we will
dictated by
assess.
this group.
dictated, right? So why, and you would have 4 years to pass those, to get those 2 credits, or to pass those 2 classes, right?
No,
No.
you'd have to complete 4 mathematics credits.
You'd have to complete 4, but are 2 of them are
2 of them would be required to be Algebra 1 and Geometry.
so why isn't that the threshold then, if it's required to pass those?
It is, because some of those skills in the 8th grade level have algebraic and geometric.
So we're teaching
Concepts.
8th grade math in high school? I guess I'm slow.
Well, what Amanda is saying is algebraic concepts, geometric concepts, they're interwoven throughout the standards, even starting at the elementary level. They're kind of interwoven. So yes, there is a course Algebra 1, there is a course Geometry, but we introduce kids and statistics as well to those principles, even sometimes beginning in the middle school level.
Yeah, we do, but they have to be competent. They don't have to be competent at a high school level. They just have to be competent at a middle school level, even though we're teaching them in high school.
High school standards, right?
Well, we test, and this is where I think the disconnect is coming. We are required by federal law and state law to test the Kentucky academic standards. And so when we administer the reading and mathematics assessment at the 10th grade level, it will test the high school and as well as the middle school
Right.
standards in reading and in mathematics. But there's a difference between the standards that we test and the approximate level that we'll use for establishing the cut score. The cut score will represent basic competence, but we will in fact test the high school and the middle school standards.
Okay.
There will still be performance levels. There'll still be novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished at the 10th grade level.
Right.
But there will be a separate score that we'll recommend to you that beyond that score, we don't think a kid has demonstrated basic competence.
And schools are still accountable to that proficiency bar.
That's
At the
right.
high school level. That's right.
I think it's important that we acknowledge that what we're doing here is introducing an accountability piece that has never existed in our system before, and it's an individual student
Right.
accountability piece. And that's where I think many of the concerns about unintended consequences of this approach come from, and they're legitimate concerns in that individual student accountability is a good thing. I think many educators have long seen the lack of an individual student accountability component as a key weakness of our system. But there is also a point at which you have to ask yourself, how much can we hold a child responsible for outcomes that are determined, at least in part, by some of the things we've talked about here today, like poverty, like family structure, like racial inequities that are baked into the institutions, right? And so we should be cautious about penalizing children for things that they don't have any control over. And I think some of the research that has pointed to disproportional impacts of exit exams in the past have come from situations where the bar was set particularly high, and then students found it very hard to climb over that bar.
That's right.
And I think what's being proposed here mitigates against those risks in significant ways by setting a bar that is minimal competency, by creating appeals avenues and processes so that if the test is not getting it done for the student, they have some other way of demonstrating that competency. And so I support the direction that we're going here, because I think it strikes that right balance of individual student accountability, but acknowledging how difficult it is to move students to higher levels of proficiency, whether at the individual level or at the school or at the state level. And I would encourage us not to let perfect be the enemy of the good. And so what we need to be looking for is, how do we move Kentucky forward? I'd love for Kentucky to be the best in the country, but quite frankly, I'm not responsible for what happens in other states. And there's a minimal amount of my care about how we compare to others. What I'm very concerned about is how we do better than what we have been doing in the past as a state. And we have made some significant strides. We've seen how policy kicks that into gear. It's more than just a conversation about college and career readiness. We've seen those rates of college and career readiness steadily increase over time, which tells us that these kinds of policies can have in the presence of many other variables, a positive impact on outcomes. And so I think all of those moving parts ought to be acknowledged as we look at how we go here. The other thing, and then I'll stop, that I would like to put on the table for future discussion is recognizing that schools across the state are still not equally resourced. And so there may be some schools for which supporting them in meeting these new requirements will be a bigger challenge than for others. And so I would encourage us that as we think about our future legislative agendas, that we consider requesting additional supports, particularly supports that could be targeted at schools that are trying to provide additional remediation or intervention services for those students who are struggling to meet these requirements, and that in our conversations with lawmakers that we make that a priority to look for how we can make sure those resources are going to the schools that need them the most.
The ACT continues to be relevant to college admission and the question of remediation. And it's my understanding that about 20% of the ACT is what they categorize as intermediate mathematics, or intermediate algebra, I think is the way they categorize it. If we eliminate Algebra 2, are we impacting the chance of college acceptance and avoidance of remediation?
No, I don't believe so. To address Algebra 2 specifically, I believe right now there are 16 states in the country that require that all of our kids successfully complete Algebra 2. As the numbers that we've talked about earlier show, our Algebra 2 requirement is a paper requirement. It's not a real requirement. So I don't believe even what we're doing now helps in preparedness for the ACT.
Does that mean we're not teaching Algebra 2 and Algebra 2, or does it mean we're finessing the requirement? Or?
I think at the very least it means we are not ensuring that kids have in fact mastered the concepts in Algebra 2 when they successfully complete the course. At the very least, that's what it means. In terms of operationally what is happening in schools, I think it probably varies in terms of how schools are handling that. But across the board, it is really clear, and I'll say without apology, that there is no way, no possible way, that all of our graduates have successfully, really successfully completed Algebra 2 by the time they leave high school.
So we're dumbing it down in the classroom.
That's one possibility.
You only have to have a D to pass the course, right? And so, I mean, by most people's standards, D isn't mastery of anything. And so, you know, that's not a high bar that represents that I've mastered all the learning targets associated with this course.
And again, even if Algebra 2 is not required, if a student is planning on taking a career path where that is going to make sense and the ACT is going to be part of, you know, heading to college, then by all means, take it.
I'll give you another example that's in that vein, Laura. For most of our post-secondary institutions, I believe, at least some of our post-secondary institutions, 2 credits in a foreign language is a requirement for admission. Very few people actually realize that's not a minimum high school graduation requirement in Kentucky.
Right.
Yet kids continue to take 2 credit hours in foreign languages because they know if they're headed to a post-secondary institution that that's part of the requirement. That it is not simply not the case, even currently, that our minimum high school graduation requirements align perfectly with the requirements for acceptance to the University of Kentucky, University of Louisville, or Morehead State. So what would be helpful to our students is guidance. To say that if you are headed to post-secondary education, this is what the requirements look like. These are the courses that you ought to be taking. But guidance and giving kids that tool to know what courses they should be taking is a far cry from saying every kid that earns a high school diploma in Kentucky needs to take this course. And the rationale that some folks have used that it doesn't align with the University of Kentucky's graduation requirements doesn't make any sense. Because if that is the case, then at the state level, we ought to start having a foreign language requirement as well.
And again, our individual learning plans, say students are going to help them know what
That's
in the
right.
world they need to take.
That's right.
So,
And districts can require it.
right.
They have the
a minimum.
opportunity to require what they want in their graduation
Yeah,
plan.
this is not boxing anyone in.
Right.
No, not at all.
As a board, are we ready to vote?
I've been ready.
All right. All those in favor of this amendment to 704 KAR 3305 as amended by this board signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Passes unanimously. I'd like to take just sort of a moment of personal privilege, if you would let me. We've had several moments of truth, difficult truth this morning. I mean, some of the slides we looked at were, quite frankly, were difficult to look at. And because I know the love of children and students in Kentucky that exists in this room here today. And I also believe that people that are in this room here today believe in the inherent ability of Kentucky's children to perform at the level, at the national, certainly at the national level, if not above. So if we know our children can perform at that level, but then we see statistics like success in post-secondary, where only 60% go and the average in the country is 70, and where we see in the average in the country is 30% receiving a bachelor's degree. In Kentucky, it's at 20%. And when we see numbers like associate's degrees and credentials that 6 years after graduation, only 10% of our students have achieved some credential, associate's degree, something, when we know that about the last thing I saw was 58% of our jobs require those credentials or associate degrees or some preparation past high school. We know we've got a big leap on both bachelor's degrees, on skill acquisition, associate's degrees. You know, something that came out this year that's troubling to me is he talked about education attainment, you know, a ranking of the states. And I know, Gary, we don't want to necessarily, you know, compare too much, but it's informative that they were talking about the percentage of adults that have bachelor's degree and associate's degree in the state, and once again, we ranked 47th in both, in bachelor attainment. And you think about where the world is heading right now, and the fact that our current classes are dramatically underperforming the nation in terms of post-secondary, when the value for education and skills is higher than ever. I think therein, at least for me, but therein lies the sense of the urgency behind our work. And the reason that I am hoping that not only today, but in the future, that we move forward. The truth of all of that is that it can't be done at this table or that table alone. So I'd ask today, anybody watching, citizens across this state, for your help in this. We have thousands and thousands of dedicated teachers in the classroom this morning, and administrators have chosen missionally to help our students get prepared for life. Associations of educators, press has a role, businesses and business leaders, legislators, foundations, families. I'd ask that today be a marker, that this 3rd of October be a marker where we change the trajectory for students in Kentucky, where we come together and we embark on this next big effort. And it has happened, there's historical perspective in Kentucky. It happened in the 90s. And I know my boss, not younger than, but my boss, business leader, at the time, he was real involved in, just as a business leader, talking about the need to move Kentucky from, I don't know the exact number, but bottom 10% in the country, back in the 70s and 80s. But we can't stay there as a state anymore. Was real involved in that effort to try to join in that effort. And Kentucky has moved. I mean, it depends on which study you look, but we've certainly moved, maybe to the top of that bottom third, somewhere in the 30s, it seems like I see, different things come out. We're in the bottom third. And I hope today that we say that together, that is not good enough. That doesn't represent the children and their potential for the future. And that we at least say, we need to move. They moved greatly in the 90s. Let's move again. Let's move at least into the top half of the nation as an urgent, immediate goal to move forward. I'm convinced, that we can better prepare students for their next step in life. But I also know it's going to take all of us, not the department, as dedicated as the department is, and quite frankly, as dedicated as our teachers and administrators are, that is just simply not enough. And so somehow, as we move forward today with what I consider a monumental step, establishing a bar for high school graduation, but finding ways on how we bring in businesses and their resources. It might be, funding summer programs for kids that we know are experiencing summer slide. It might be just supportive for school systems and legislators, but as a state that we pull together, and today marks a different trajectory for outcomes in this state. I very much appreciate the work that's been done, Commissioner, your staff putting this together, and the initiative to say this is one way that over time here we can make a big difference in kids' life. But I'd continue to urge you to bring forward bold ideas that are going to help our kids that we know have the ability to do it. So thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
And thanks for the time.
Thank you.
All right, and I know we've been going a long time, but we're near the end. If you don't mind, if we can just, I think, you tell me, do we need a break for a couple minutes, or we okay going on? All right. I think we're on our last agenda item, and this agenda item is next steps on the identification and appointment of the Kentucky Commissioner of Education. Thank you. Yeah, if we could pass out. Do we have copies for all the board members?
I do.
So at yesterday's meeting, we passed a motion to hire Dr. Lewis as the permanent commissioner pending negotiation of a contract, and you authorized me to negotiate with him for a contract. Being passed out right now is a contract that has been signed by Dr. Lewis. It has not been signed by me, because waiting for your authority to do that. A couple of highlights: it follows a template that has been used in the past. The salary level, which appears on page 2, is the median. Looked at the 7 surrounding state average for their commissioners, their chief state school officers, and this salary was set at that median level for the surrounding states. It happens to match Tennessee, for instance, exactly. The other aspects are essentially the same as previous contracts. It's a four-year contract with, maybe need a minute to look through there. Benefits would be the same as essentially any employee in state government. There is a longevity bonus that appeared in previous contract or contracts that would be earned assuming, 3 years of successful employment. But the contract is for 4 years. So maybe we'll just take a minute here and you can page through that. Salaries on page 2 might be a high point. The topics of termination for cause and without cause are, again, followed exactly the template from the past. Death or disability, voluntary termination. So once you are comfortable with that, I'd accept a motion and second, and then discussion.
Mr. Chairman, to get discussion going, if there is any, I move that we accept the contract and approve it as proposed and signed by the interim commissioners.
Okay. A motion by Rich Gimmel. Do we have a second?
Second the motion.
Second from Milton Seymour. Any discussion or need more time to review? I don't want to rush anybody. Okay.
3 minutes for 6-page hits.
Okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It's unanimous. Congratulations. There is although it's early, there's some lunch available here for KBE members, just for your information if you are staying here. I know some of us are here for committee meetings that'll go on in the afternoon. At this point, if there's no other business, I'd accept the motion for adjournment.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion from Joe. Second from Kathy. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
What committee?
We're adjourned.